I'm introducing Nick Bowden and Ben Wheeler from the University of Otago, and they are going to be talking to us about their recent paper that's just been published in Diabetologia about type 1 diabetes and educational outcomes in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So first of all, Ben, could you give me a little bit of the background to this study and explain what we already knew about educational outcomes in type 1 diabetes and why you were interested in looking into it further?
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for having us, Catherine. I don't think I need to tell the readers of Diabetologia and viewers here about the impacts of diabetes too much, but in children, it's one of the most common chronic illnesses we deal with, and it has both the perturbations in glucose levels, which have been identified as having issues on brain development and function, but also the substantial psychosocial burdens that come with both the therapy and living with diabetes. So Nick and I and our whole team, were quite interested in how that might go with other aspects of life. We're often focusing on health, but we're very interested to now start to move out and cast a wider lens on some of the impacts and burdens of diabetes to really get a richer understanding of things. So education is what we were focusing on in this manuscript.
And it looks like there were a few previous studies that have been a little bit unclear, that indicating perhaps different outcomes in different populations that had already been done on this area.
Yeah, that's right. There's some literature here, but some beautiful work from particularly Scandinavian countries in the past. But there are some issues, in particular, people who've been unenrolled from education and people who have been in special forms of education haven't been included in that data. And also one of the strengths in the New Zealand context is the richness of our ethnicity data collection as well. So if you're really wanting to look at equity or perhaps inequity across both health and, I guess, as we're moving into other areas, education, we felt that the sort of data we could get from New Zealand might provide a richer context to overlay on what's been there before.
Well, thank you. And Nick, I understand that New Zealand has a particular way of a data system whereby health and other social and cultural forms of data are linked together that you've found particularly useful as a framework for looking at this question. Would you be able to give us a little bit of a background to that, please?
Yeah, certainly. And kia ora, Catherine, and thank you again for having us on. Look, I think one of the real strengths of our paper is the ability to tap into this really rich source of data for research in New Zealand. And so it's called the Integrated Data Infrastructure, or IDI for short. So it's a research database that's managed by Statistics New Zealand, and is made available for research that's deemed to be for the public good. So I'll just run you through a few of the sort of key strengths of the IDI. Firstly, it contains population level data, which basically means it has information on everyone that's resident in New Zealand. It contains data across a range of life domains, if you like. So, for example, health, education, the labour market, the criminal justice system. And then crucially, these data sets can all be linked at the individual level, and also, in fact, can be linked to other family members. So, for example, children linked to their mothers, and even other members of the household as well. And then finally, the majority of these data sets in the IDI, certainly the main ones, go back over about 20 years. And so we have the ability to track individuals over quite a substantial period of their lives. So in terms of in this particular paper, we accessed birth registration data to construct a 9-year birth cohort. Then that's linked to health data to identify those with and without type 1 diabetes. Education data, of course, for our educational outcomes. And then a couple of the slightly more nuanced parts of the study design were the ability to, I guess, take into account early exit from the study due to both mortality and overseas travel. So, for example, young people who leave the country and don't come back. So we've got access to customs data to do that as well. So yeah, I think quite a big strength of the study, to be honest, is this really amazing strategic resource we have in New Zealand for research.
Yeah. And that sounds like ideal, really, an ideal framework to harness to look at this question. Ben, what aspects of education were you looking at particularly, and what aspects of diabetes-related factors did you want to draw together to examine?
Yeah, so we've taken our cohort with diagnosis in the primary school age. We've also taken a particular focus on those who had much younger diabetes diagnoses. So even in the preschool age group, where maybe the developing brain may be more susceptible to variations in glucose level or the extremes of glucose level. So we've followed that 9-year cohort through, and we've looked at a range of attainment of educational outcomes in that secondary school range, but then also looked at attendance data. So we were able to look at whether children with diabetes and those without diabetes, and control for a whole range of socio-demographic factors, been able to look at whether they're attending at a similar rate. And then we've been able to look into tertiary education, and in this paper, look at enrolment at tertiary education, but we haven't been able to, in this cohort, look through into completion or into, I guess, the real further outcomes in later life, but very much university enrolment, all of the secondary school educational attainments that we'd expect, and attendance are our primary focus.
And thank you. And then, Nick, were you able to stratify some of that information and based on socioeconomic aspects and ethnicity and cultural diversity?
Yeah, so look, a main analysis explored the overall association at a population level between those between type 1 diabetes and the educational outcomes that Ben just mentioned. And we did adjust for a range of both socio-demographic and maternal characteristics. So adjustment for sex, socio-economic deprivation level, urban, rural, profile of residence, as well as the mother's age at the birth of the child, mother's highest education level, the place of birth of the mother, so just a binary variable, whether she was born in New Zealand or not, and also the number of siblings. So it's quite a nice suite of covariates to adjust for there in the models. And then, as you've mentioned, we also stratified or looked at particular subsamples of the population as well. And as Ben talked about earlier, in particular, we stratified by ethnicity, which is really important in New Zealand. So we examined the relationship between type 1 diabetes and educational outcomes for Māori, who are the indigenous population of New Zealand, and also for Pacific, who do account for quite a large proportion of the young population in New Zealand, migrants and their descendants from countries throughout the Pacific region. And both these two groups, they're considered priority learners by the New Zealand Ministry of Education. And so hence one of the reasons for examining these populations separately. They both also face substantial inequities in education and in health. And for Māori as well, there's a constitutional basis, if you like, for rights to equity in New Zealand as well. And so several really sort of important reasons for us to pursue that angle. And I guess as part of the team, we were very fortunate to have two Māori and two Pacific researchers on the team that were able to lead and have control over those particular aspects of the studies. So that was one part there. And then going back to, I guess, some of the things that Ben was talking about in terms of the sort of subgroups of those with type 1 diabetes, we wanted to look at those who'd had a post type 1 diabetes diagnosis, hospitalization for either hypoglycemia or diabetic ketoacidosis, and also for those that had that really early onset diabetes as well. So comparing those groups again to the population without type 1 diabetes.
On the basis that their type of type 1 diabetes or the trajectory of type 1 diabetes might be a little bit more severe in those young people. Yeah,
that's the idea. I think, for that younger group, perhaps a greater effect on the developing brain. And then, for the, I guess, perhaps a bit of a proxy, those hospitalizations for more sort of disruptive diabetes as well.
And glycemic variability, I guess, which we can't measure it in this sort of population-based data, but admissions for extremes of high and low might give us some idea of more disrupted glycemic variation.
So would you be able to tell me a little bit about what your findings were for this study?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the main analyses, we found statistically significant associations between type 1 diabetes and all of those 4 educational outcomes of interest that we explored. So we found that for young people with type 1 diabetes, they were approximately 9% less likely to attend high school regularly. They were 12% less likely to attain a university level entrance qualification while at high school, and then 7% less likely to be enrolled in university by the time they turned 20. And we found that the direction of these associations was consistent across all the subgroups that we analysed as well. So the strongest associations were observed among those that had been hospitalised at some point for DKA or hypoglycemia. So, for example, in that population, they were 24% less likely to attain a university entrance level qualification compared to those without type 1 diabetes. For Māori, we found significant associations with type 1 diabetes and obtaining a university entrance level qualification. So they were 17% less likely to obtain that compared to Māori without type 1 diabetes. And again, for Pacific, they were 6% less likely to obtain any high school level qualification compared to Pacific without type 1 diabetes. And then all of these findings were robust to the different sensitivity analyses that we employed as well. So that took into account missing education data and also dealt with the possibility that enrolment in specialist schools might impact on findings as well.
So that's quite a big difference really across all groups, and then particularly among those who are particularly at risk of learning, the Māori groups and those that what was the word that you had for them, specialist learners, or
that was just
identified learners as
priority
learners. Yes. So and then to what extent do you think your findings could be more widely applicable to other countries and other populations?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really good question. And to be honest, it's probably not one that we can, well, it isn't one that we can definitively answer through this study. I think the first thing to say, and we've sort of alluded to it at the beginning of the discussion, is that there have been several really high quality contemporary studies in this space from countries around the world, including Sweden, Denmark, Scotland and Wales. But the results from these studies are not consistent across all of the studies. And so some find associations with type 1 diabetes and educational outcomes and some don't. So I think it's entirely possible that some of these findings are country specific. And that could be because the different health and education systems in these countries, access to diabetes treatments, for example, perhaps variations in the supports that are afforded to these young people with diabetes in the education system. I think it's also probably likely that differences in the study designs are contributing to some of the inconsistent findings as well. So, for example, the different ways we measure educational outcomes. I think I would argue that probably one of the strengths of our study is that we're incorporating high stakes assessments here that are evaluated over several years of high schooling, both internally assessed as well as tests at the end of the year. So, different studies are employing different measures of educational outcomes. There are different populations that are of interest that are included in the studies, and also, I guess, different time periods as well. And so perhaps access to different diabetes-related technologies over time could influence the results too. So, difficult one to answer. I think there's a couple areas where all of the studies do agree. One is the association with lower attendance rates. So I think we can be pretty confident there. And we also know through many other studies that if you are less likely to attend school than you are less likely to attain in school. So I think those results line up. And the other area of consistency is in relation to I guess more disruptive diabetes. So in our study, that was people that had been hospitalized for DKL, hypoglycemia. In other studies, it was in relation to glucose levels, and so those findings have been pretty consistent as well.
And I guess it builds on that experimental data too, doesn't it, Nick? Where disruptions in glucose, both very low glucose levels and following DKA, using MRI and psychometric testing, they really do appear to show disruptions, particularly in younger children. So I guess the findings aren't a surprise, and I think for some of the reasons Nick's identified, I think it is more likely that there are some negative outcomes, particularly in these sort of cohorts before much more advanced diabetes therapies have been deployed as well, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that leads me on to the next question, Ben, because I think having more robust evidence of this kind, although you were saying the findings were perhaps not a surprise, having some robust evidence will perhaps help to inform governments about policies that they can put in place. Have you got advice that you would give to health authorities and educational authorities to try to counteract these issues with children with type 1 diabetes?
Yeah, no, I think that's the really comes to the crux of the matter, doesn't it? I guess one of the important take-home messages is diabetes is more than just the health outcomes. Diabetes is an illness that impacts all of a person and all of their family and their whānau, that Māori word for family and all those around you, and therefore, we need to put in place, as robust a package of support as we can, both within health and in education and beyond, if we want to really achieve equity for people, with health issues and with disability, and any other area where we feel that equity is important. I think support within the school system, and as well support within the health system, and in particular accessing all of the therapies we know can improve outcomes. And I guess for children and young people, for many of us, it's around discussions with funders around accessing, in particular, say, technology at the moment. We know continuous glucose monitoring, we know automated insulin delivery are going to improve glucose variability. Those systems are available, and so I think worldwide, maybe targeting equity of access to those systems is going to be important.
Yeah, no, that sounds key, really. So what's next for you both? Do you plan to continue in this area of research and take it a bit further?
Yeah, well, I think there's lots of areas here. We're very interested in equity issues with diabetes and beyond. So education is one area, but I guess the natural progression of this work would be to look, Nick, I guess, at later educational attainment, at this sort of data that's available in New Zealand can link to income.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that the particular cohort of the age group that you were looking at, there was not yet data on finishing university and outcomes in terms of the job market after that. So I suppose that data is going to become available as time goes on.
Yeah, look, one of the I didn't mention it at the start, but the IDI is refreshed, if you like, every 3 months of the year, and so new data sets are added to the IDI, but the existing ones are updated. So we're continually getting more information, and I think what we tried to do in this study is really maximize the utility of the available data in the IDI, which was really the first 20 years of life. It won't be long before we have, and probably could access, even now, a couple of more years compared to when we did this study, which will enable us to look at, completion of university study, and for those that don't go to university, the first sort of, 3 or 4 years of their working life post high school as well. So yeah, from a social science perspective, I'd be really interested to see if, how this plays out after education through the labour market, in particular.
Yeah, No, I think it, yeah, does sound, it's going to be really interesting seeing how things progress, and then also I suppose as new, the later years will probably show a different proportion of different kinds of diabetes technologies being used as well, which may have an impact too. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, education's been working on techniques to improve outcomes in school. So there's going to be, I guess, a twofold attack. You know, there's improvements in education and understanding the needs of those who have, you know, greater issues. I guess improving equity in those who already are having difficulties. But things that minimize glucose variability are going to be really interesting from a health and, you know, targeting the root cause perspective. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Well, thank you both very much for talking to me today, and very best wishes for your future research. And yeah, good to speak to you.